This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me here today, I have Dr. Trent Trombley, who you have all heard from before. Hello, Dr. Trombley. How's it going?
Well, how are you, Gabby?
I'm very good, thank you. But this is not just a repeat visit by Dr. Trombley. I also have Dr. Goodson of Cambridge. How is it going, Dr. Goodson?
It's going all right.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear it. I'm really excited to have both of you on because you both do things that are very interesting, but is something that doesn't happen enough in bioarchaeology, I think. And I'm being very vague for no reason. Dr. Trombley is a bioarchaeologist. He makes sense. We all understand why he's on the show, this biological anthropology show. Dr. Goodson is a historian, and you two are collaborators.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I was wondering, I guess, let me start from here, which is, to me, it makes all the sense in the world to have a historian and a bioarchaeologist pair up, but it doesn't happen all the time. How did you two meet in the first place?
Yeah, I met Caroline through a mentor of mine, Dr. Patrick Beauchesne, as well as my PhD advisor, Dr. Sabrina Agarwal. They had been collaborating, or had I believe, started collaboration with you, Caroline, right? Back in 2014 or maybe 13, something like that, about a project and a site that you had excavated with Dr. Elizabeth Ventris. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in 2005 to 2010, I worked with a team of people, including Elizabeth Ventris and Marco Maiuro, on a site south of Rome called Villa Magna, which was an imperial villa, so a Roman imperial villa that became a medieval monastery. And my collaborators were mostly Roman archaeologists, and I am a historian, but I'm also a trained field archaeologist. And so I was working on the medieval questions of this site that was in use from about the year, let's say, 200 CE to about the year 1500 CE. And as part of that excavation, we uncovered and excavated stratigraphically a fairly large cemetery of the Middle Ages. So we had a cemetery with a few hundred individuals in it, which we had given some really kind of basic anthropological survey. And we've got some sort of broad picture data on the demography and the population and a little bit of attention to paleopathologies. But then after that excavation and its publication had wrapped up, I thought it would be really interesting to push that a bit further. So I started working with Patrick and with Sabrina, and then Trent came on board with a couple of other PhD students to do more work on the individuals of Villa Magna. So I think that's how we met. And in fact, the article that we wrote together is based on those people who lived at Villa Magna.
Yes. And so this collaboration seems like the most natural thing to me in the world. Like, we have someone examining physical evidence, and then I don't think I've actually had a historian on the show before. Can you explain what kind of evidence historians use? Like, what do they look at?
Well, so I am a historian who looks a lot at archaeological evidence to try and answer historical questions. But a historical question is one that is based fundamentally on the textual record rather than the material record. And that's what most historians spend their time looking at. And so in the case of medieval Italy, which is where I work most of the time, I work with a range of different sources, which can be things like property documents about who owned which parcel of land, who they were related to, who they passed it on to. So like a will, or like a property document, or things that are more general like histories. But as Trent will know, we've looked at a lot of different textual sources to try and answer questions about medieval mouths. So one thing that's important to kind of think about is that just like the archaeological record is spotty, and you don't always get to dig what you want to dig or where you want to dig, or you don't always get the kind of quality of data that you might hope for. Similarly, the textual record is spotty, so you don't always, you don't always get the document that explains precisely what you want to know about the past. So historians tend to use textual sources, and in my case, also material sources, to try and think about who did what, when, and why in the past.
That's a perfect explanation. And then for listeners who aren't familiar with archaeologists, like what we call their evidence, you called it material remains. So that's anything that are actual objects that people have left behind. So that's anything from like a potsherd to an entire house, really. And then Dr. Trombley, you focus on biological remains. And this is the happy harmony that we live in when we study the past. Well, mostly harmonious. There have been some kerfuffles in the past between archaeologists and historians, at least in colonial Virginia, which is where I quote unquote grew up academically.
Sure. Yeah.
No, but this is really, really cool. You bring up some really good points about the historical record. Just because people are around and writing, it doesn't mean that we're going to get a full picture of what actually was happening. One, like the people who write stuff down, that's not typically everyone is writing stuff down. It's not like 2024. Even in 2024, there's people who don't have access to write down their point of view. But then also there are things that sometimes people take for granted that they don't write down, right? Like they just don't, it doesn't even occur to them to write down that someone would ever care about how to use this thingamabob. And then you find the thingamabob and you're like, how the heck, what was it for?
Yep, that's exactly right.
We always joke that when archaeologists find something they don't know what it's for, it was for ceremonial purposes.
Ritual.
Ritual purposes. Exactly. But that's really cool that you're like in the documentary record, you're in the archaeological record, you're in the biological archaeological record, and you're melding it all together to get this really interesting paper on a thing that I think a lot of people don't think about that much. If you've listened to the show with Dr. Trombley before, then you know where this is going. We are talking about mouths, which immediately made me hyper conscious of my own mouth. I think like the first place to start with mouths is what were medieval mouths actually like? Because I think we all have this image in our head from movies of like these horrible hags with like missing teeth and like just rot. What were they actually like?
Yeah, that was actually, I think, the question that really prompted Caroline and I to try to work together on this, because I think and I think we say this in the article, it's paradoxically a simple question and very elusive to try to answer that, because I think any good historian will tell you, well, where and when are you talking about, right? The medieval period is a pretty large period, and from my understanding, would be largely the 1,000 years between roughly 500 AD and 1500, or sorry, CE and 1500 CE, roughly. And that's a pretty big time period. And there's a lot of geographic and temporal variability there. And so when you're trying to figure out and pin down what were medieval mouths like, I think you have to start to ask, well, where are you talking about? And so this is where I think the collaboration between historians and bioarchaeologists can be fruitful, but also challenging. And some of the challenges you run into, and one of the things that bioarchaeologists I think run into as an issue is we can provide some of that bottom up sort of history by looking at the individuals themselves, maybe people who weren't written in text. The challenges then come down to what about your chronology and time period? And this is something that Carolyn and I dealt with quite a bit, in that a lot of skeletons and a lot of bioarchaeological analyses will tend towards aggregation. That means we oftentimes try to increase sample sizes, and we try to get enough sample size to do these large statistical sort of questions or techniques, et cetera. And we can start to lump people from 2 to 3 to 4 to sometimes 5. I've definitely been at conferences and seen people say, oh, this is my analysis of medieval spines, and they've lumped over 1,200 years of individuals in there. I could see Caroline shaking her head, and I would say any historian in the crowd would just start to scream and say, what are you doing? You're lumping so much, you're smoothing out so many important, interesting, nuanced variabilities there in terms of histories and local biology. So that was something we ran into. And so I think what we wanted to do was start as a sort of funnel approach. What were medieval mouths like at a large sort of epistemological level? What do we know about them from textual, spiritual, biblical sort of evidence? What do we know about them in terms of the studies that have been done on an aggregate level? So we have a lot of people who've done what we call meta-analyses. They look at a bunch of different studies, aggregate the data, and sort of plot them in chronological time. There have been a good number of studies who've done that. What Caroline and I found out, and one reviewer suggested to us, and we implemented it, was no one had really done it within the medieval period. They had just plotted the medieval period as like a point. So they would say like, oh, here's the Roman period, here's the medieval period, here's the early modern period, and here's the modern period, or something like, or age of industrialization or something like that. We didn't ever get to see the variability within the medieval period. So that's one of the things we did. And then the real funnel at the end of that was trying to look at these two individuals at the site of Philomania. So we really started big and tried to come small into these two individuals to really try to ground that context as best we could.
And I think you certainly did that. I want to take like a brief pause here just to tell readers that the article that we've all kind of obliquely mentioned a few times now, it's called Medieval Mouths in Context, Biocultural and Multiscalar Considerations of the Mouth and the Case of Late Medieval Villomania, Italy, which is a great article, and it's easily accessible. And I'm going to put it in the show notes. But you can also Google it if you don't like clicking on links in the show notes. Like I know I mentioned this to you last time. I really appreciate how easy it is to find your articles online. Okay, so epistemological approach. That is a big word, Dr. Goodson. What is that? Why do that? What does it mean?
So with anything, but definitely with the human body, there are different ways of knowing, and there's different ways through which people come to know or come to think about their mouths and their bodies. And those things inevitably shape the kinds of questions that we as bioarchaeologists or we as historians can ask of what happened. So we can generate, and Trent has generated quite a lot of finely grained data points about physical specimens. But when we want to think about, well, what are people's mouths like? We want to know not only fine grained detail about how many teeth had cavities in them, or how many teeth people had or didn't have at the time of their death. We also want to know, what did they use to think through? What might that have meant to them? So there are overlapping ways of knowing. There are overlapping epistemologies. There's one, Trent alluded to it earlier, about a kind of sacred concept, biblical models about what mouths might have been. So there are references to mouths in the Bible. The Bible is the most commonly is the most familiar text in the European Latin West. I think it's fair to say not everyone might have read it, but people certainly would have heard it, and people would have heard passages of the Bible, and they would have been broadly familiar with the framework of description in the Bible, which allows for kind of a literal reading of what the Bible says, but also a symbolic reading of what the text, the sacred text, says. But that's just kind of one layer of knowing. There are also epistemologies of health and of goodness, right? And so thinking about, we have an idea of disease, which is a post-19th century idea of disease. We have microscopes and we can see what bacteria actually look like, and we can understand how they interact with good bacteria, bad bacteria, right? That's a way of knowing about disease and health that's quite different from how people conceptualize disease and health in the past. So we wanted to try and find ways to pick apart these different ways of knowing or ways of thinking about mouths. So we looked at a number of different textual sources of a real wide variety. So we could look at recipe books for medical treatments. We could look at narrative sources of saints' lives and deaths in which mouths feature in the account. We could look at at records of people's descriptions of their own mouths or of other people's mouths. And we can use all of these different, we can use these different sort of sets of texts or elements of the textual record and overlay them onto what we're actually seeing, that fine-grained set of data points that Trent was able to generate from his analyses.
Yes. One thing that I would like to note for listeners, which is if you don't keep a diary and you're interested in keeping a diary and you're like, who would ever read this? Historians of the future will read it with great interest. There is a pretty famous set of diaries, William Byrd of Virginia. He wrote down every single day what he ate, which is an incredibly rich record of the food that people, and I used it in my honors thesis in undergrad. And you would not believe the things that people ate, and you just wouldn't think about it at all. He also wrote down every time he boinked his wife. Like, it's like literally just incredible levels of details that you think that no one would want, but people will read it. I guess the flip side of that
It
is,
sounds like a historian's dream.
oh my God,
microhistory. Yeah.
it's incredible. It's really, really good. And he had like all of the genteel society of Virginia coming to visit him. So like he would say like kind of mean things about people as they came through his house in his diary. But yes. So anyway, here is my plea to you to keep your own diary. So when you're looking at these different ways of knowing of how people thought about mouths, what are some of the concepts that people had? Like starting maybe from the biblical perspective, how were people conceptualizing mouths?
Yeah. Do you want me to go, Caroline?
Yeah.
So, when we looked at some of the textual evidence coming from both the Bible and other, as well as Psalms and sermons, I think it really becomes interesting to see the way in which the mouth was seen as a sort of interface, and sometimes maybe even a spiritual interface. It might not seem like that to a lot of people today. I think you could get a lot of people maybe there today with thinking about Eucharist or anything, using any sort of consumption, right? Using the mouth as the sort of ingress for consuming the flesh and blood of Christ. I think that would maybe get people to start thinking about it that way. And we see some of those references as well in the medieval period, and both biblically and as well as sermons. But we also see the way in which, stemming from an Aristotelian perspective, so this was coming from classical notions from Aristotle, where does the soul reside? And it seems to be, generally speaking, the soul often was conceptualized to reside in breath. And we often see that articulated as pneuma, Pneuma. And we think about pneuma today, you think of it as the lungs, right? Having something like pneumatic, something like a pneumothorax is like your lung is collapsed or something, right?
Pneumonia,
But
yeah.
pneumonia, sure. But pneuma seems to have been a pretty important conception of the soul residing in breath, to where when someone died, you would know because it was their last breath. That is the soul actually leaving their body. And that means that the mouth ends up being a really important sort of interface as well. The thing I'm a bit quite more familiar with is also this notion that Caroline mentioned of trying to treat mouths and how they're seen as the body epistemologically through what we call the humoral system. And this would be largely humoral medicine. Now, this was probably, I think, arguably the prevalent sort of idea of medicinal thought at the time, or the sort of medical framework. Like Caroline said, maybe not everyone would have read Galen or any of this text, but people probably would have been broadly familiar with the humoral system. And this is the idea that you have various bodily humors, each associated with a season as well as some sort of quality. And they also seem to be mapped with psychographic properties as well. So I'll give you some examples. From Hippocrates, which this stems from, he articulated 4 major humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Black bile was seen as cold and dry. It was seasonally related to autumn, often associated with melancholic behavior. Yellow bile, hot and dry, related to summer, more choleric behavior, so ambitious or aggressive. Phlegm, cold and dry, often related to winter, phlegmatic behavior, so more reserved, I suppose. And then blood, hot and wet, related to spring, sanguine nature. I'd say it's likened to energy or vigor, active, social, enthusiastic would maybe be the adjectives I'd use there. And the idea was is you wanted to have a balance in the humors. And that would be what we called eucrasia. You'd try to have this balance of humors. And if it went into dysbiosis or an imbalance, you'd have dyscrasia. And it was thought at the time that many of the diseases were probably caused by this imbalance of the humors. That, as Caroline said, not from this post 19th century understanding that we have today, but that oral disease and many other diseases might have been caused by either bad airs that you've ingested, again through the mouth, or through some sort of humoral imbalance. And this is why we argue, I think that the mouth was an important sort of interface with the world, because if it could be seen as the way of ingesting disease or bad air, or through disbalance or imbalance of these humors. And so oftentimes the prescriptions are actually dietetic, they're food based. And so the mouth becomes a really important means of also trying to cure these humors.
Right. Because also every food has its own humoral properties as well.
Bingo. Exactly.
It's really interesting. And I think this is a really great place for people who haven't really engaged with historical research to kind of enter, because it really, when you grow up today, right, you have such a set concept, or at least if you grow up in the West, you have such a set concept of disease, right? This like very biological, medical concept of disease, where we're like you described, like we can see now we can see the viruses and the bacteria and whatnot. But when you don't have any of that, you're really just trying to come up with some system. And this was the prevailing system. You mentioned Galen and Hippocrates, like that wasn't medieval times, that was ancient times. So this is a prevailing philosophy for thousands of years.
Yeah, almost 2,000 years, I'd say, right, Caroline? Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people, by the time we get to like the year 1000 or the year sort of 1200, which is when the people that we really focused on lived, people weren't very conscious of, oh, this is an Aristotelian concept. Oh,
Yeah,
this is a
sure.
concept written down by Galen. It was part of the kind of framework of thinking. So this was a really, really long lasting understanding of how the body worked and how people could interact with it. And what people produced a lot of scientific, I'm going to put those in scare quotes, right? Scientific, maybe not scientific in the way that we would think of it now, but people really trying to be rational and consistent and using observation to record what happens, when somebody is treated for an imbalance in their humors, and what recipes of tonics or food-based medicines worked or didn't work. So you can get records of 13th century surgeons that describe their practices, their observations of patients and their practices. And you can get recipe books which make notes about this is effective. This recipe worked for, in our case, tooth pain, but also for other kinds of maladies.
So I want to come back to that, because I want to talk about like what people thought about doctors. But I think there's like one other component that I read about in your article that I had not thought about, which was like religious medicine. So using, for example, this is crazy because it just fell out of my head and I grew up Catholic. Relics, there we go. Using relics to cure teeth pain or tooth pain. Oh my goodness. Using relics to cure tooth pain, or it's things like that. Can you kind of describe how that fits into the worldview? Like if you have humors and then you also have these like how did this all kind of live together? And maybe can you also explain a little bit more about like how people thought religion played into their health? Either one of you.
You want to try, Caroline?
Well, yeah, I'll give it a stab, and then you can join in when you want to. So what I was saying earlier, I think really stands, that you can have multiple layers of knowing, right, and you can have multiple layers of understanding, and it's not that either you operate under a kind of Galenic understanding of the humoral balance of the body, or a Christian providential God or some saint is going to solve things for me way of thinking. I think those probably coexisted quite happily in a lot of people's minds. And I mean, I don't want to make too many contemporary comparisons, but I think there are quite a lot of people who have multiple different sets of reasoning applying to the way they manage their own body now, right? So some of which is going to be pharmaceutical, and some of which is not going to be pharmaceutical, and those can coexist.
Absolutely. How many people's mothers tell them things like, "Oh, you feel you have an upset stomach, you better drink some Coca-Cola." Or you're sick, here's a little Vapo rub. And then like she's still going to give you antibiotics, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So the period of time that we're talking about, the Middle Ages, and I think this is true whether you're talking about the period 500 or you're talking about the period 1500 or anywhere in between. It is, at least in Europe and in Western Europe, Latin speaking, but also, to be frank, in Greek speaking the Eastern Roman Empire of what we call Byzantium, there is a very strong sense of the world being something that was created by the Christian God. And therefore, everything in the world is created by the Christian God. And therefore, the Christian God has some responsibility for or with all of the things that happen in the world. And that might happen in a very direct, way. You might get struck by lightning if you're particularly sinful or wicked, but also in a kind of indirect way. Like you might get a toothache if you're being wicked, or if you're not being wicked at all, but some evil in the world in the form of some kind of demon might have decided to possess you and need to be then eradicated. And what's great for getting rid of demons are saints. So, this kind of sense of explaining the things that are happening around people was extremely pervasive in the Middle Ages. And it's not a hard and fast, straightforward, I don't know, prescription, oh, you've got a toothache, you need to have a relic held in front of you. But we do have senses of ways in which the spiritual can interact with people's bodies by healing illness. And so that can be when people visit shrines or when people are put in the presence of a spiritual object like a relic, which is a part of the body of a saint. A saint, specifically a martyr, but also a saint. So this was just one of these epistemologies of people living in medieval Europe, that God and the spiritual can transcend the everyday, and that can go down to even things like a sore tooth.
I really loved a story that you included in your article about Edward the Sixth's like kind of attempt at public health. Can you tell that story, please?
Yes. So this is a funny instance where this stems from this particular saint, one that Carolyn and I tried to do some work on, called Saint Apollonia, who was a third century. You often see articulated as a virgin martyr who had purportedly all of her teeth removed, whether they were sort of punched out or forcibly extracted. It's a bit ambiguous, I think, based on the evidence. But regardless, she becomes canonized later on as the patron saint of dentistry and toothache, often artistically depicted as a woman with a set of pincers, so irons with a tooth pinched in between, and typically some sort of either the palm of the martyr or in one hand, or some sort of book, maybe signifying that she's educated. We often see that she's a deaconess. And so in the 17th century, Edward VI says that, you know what, I want all of her teeth brought together. I want them to all be consolidated here. So let's get all of her teeth that have been relics consolidated into one place. And what seems to happen, at least according to the chronicler Thomas Fuller, is that a ton of teeth, a literal ton of teeth, show up in this sort of courtyard. As we know, most humans evolutionarily will have 32 teeth. So there's a bit too many teeth in this pile to account for one individual. The MNI, the minimum number of individuals, is very high. And so he astonished says, quote, "Were her stomach proportional to her teeth, a county would scarce afford her a meal's meat," end quote. And so it just kind of is, we included it because it's somewhat humorous, but it's probably meant to show too that there is this sort of interesting aspect of relics and notions of relics. And did people, contribute to could contribute their own teeth or other people's teeth to as a form of relics or something like that. And so for us, it was a sort of interesting window into that.
And I think this actually kind of backs into the thing that I wanted to talk about earlier, which is how did people think about doctors? Like, did people trust doctors? Did people think they were good at their jobs? Did people think that if they went to a doctor, they would be cured?
That's a good question. I think the hard part for me to answer that is that doctors, or the way, I guess we would call them more physicians, which would be similar in our contemporary idea, but the education wasn't necessarily formalized. I think the first medical schools in Salerno in the 14th century, if I remember correctly.
Even earlier, even earlier.
Earlier, okay. And so what probably would have happened, and this is kind of why we focused on this case of Villamagna, is that would there have been a formal physician in this case? I don't know. I think it'd be hard to say maybe if there was, and especially when it comes to things like tooth pain or toothache. We have especially in the U.S., a very bifurcated training regimen insurance program that bifurcates dentistry from doctors or physicians. And you see that articulated even in movies and comedies, that someone will say they're a doctor and they say, well, you're a dentist. So we have they're very separate. In this case, I think people would have probably occupied a variety of roles. And I would say for sure that at least from 15th century onwards, dentists are seen as a sort of charlatans or quacks. And you see this a lot in the 17th century in France and Paris, especially, because you'd have these sort of traveling tooth pullers or tooth drawers, as they were called. And they would come to your town and have some sort of gimmick to be able to extract teeth. Sometimes it would be, we will tie a string around your tooth and ride a horse really fast to pull it out. Or when the firearms are invented, we'll try to shoot the tooth out of your mouth or flick your tooth out with a sword. So it becomes this very almost circusy form of performance. And it's not really until the 17th century 17th, 18th century, when you see formal dentistry crystallize as a rigorous profession. And that really starts in Paris. But at the time, you see all these very fun artistic depictions. If you go look at Hieronymus Bosch's Haywain triptych, at the very bottom of it, of the center panel, is a dentist pulling the tooth out of a woman. But the dentist is wearing a dunce cap, meant to sort of signify that, be careful of this person. He's got a lot of weird arcane stuff on the table. There's another one. Lucas van Leyden has one called The Dentist. It's an engraving, and it shows the dentist extracting a tooth, but the dental assistant is picking the pocket of the patient, meaning to show, don't trust dentists. It's basically a racket. You're going to get your tooth extracted, but they're going to steal money from you. So I think there was some degree of skepticism. How widespread this was, I'm not sure. I think that's harder to say.
Can I ask you about tooth worms?
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Caroline? Sorry, right there.
Just before we get on toothworms, I was going to say there's a lot to think about in terms of urban versus rural.
Ooh,
and
yes.
Educated versus not educated here, because it is true that in the ancient world, there was someone called a medicus, and there was somebody who was a professional responsible for some aspect of health of the body, probably more of the body than of the teeth, just as Trent said. And there were schools of medical knowledge. They were very urban. So Alexandria, Salerno, Ravenna, Rome, and then later on, Paris and London were places of the transmission of knowledge, usually through texts, usually through reading Galen or later Galenic treatises. And that's very male, only men who do it. It's very much rooted in these university cities, and it's a very specialist form of knowledge, which may or may not have related to what people actually did if they had a toothache or an upset stomach or whatever. And the site that we focused on for our very specific kind of microanalysis of individuals and of that population is in the countryside. It's at a monastery, it's true, but it's not like one of those fancy monasteries like, Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose that has a huge library or anything in it. There's no library here. There's no evidence that anybody is like keeping books of any variety at Villamagna. I mean, it's an important place within its regional context, but it is not a place where there's going to be a professionally trained medic who has read Galen or whatever medieval version of Galen might have been circulating. And so we have to then think a little bit about how does healthcare get delivered outside of these hyper-urban university centers, and by which distant echo is the kind of professional training that's happening there arriving into the ears of people, and what tools do they actually have to do anything? What recipes can they actually make from the very large repertoire of medicinal tonics that were they're circulating? Could they actually get the recipe ingredients that they needed? And in the absence of that, what did people do? Did they live with an awful lot of pain? Did they do what they could with the ingredients that they had available to them? These are questions that are very hard to answer.
Mhm.
And that's why we looked very closely at what the actual sort of evidence is from what people's mouths were like. What can we see them doing to remediate pain, for instance?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that you did is you included just some recipes that people used in your paper. And there was one that stood out to me that was, and I'm quoting, it's for whitening black teeth and strengthening corroded or rotted gums, and for bad smelling mouth. This works best. Take some each of cinnamon, clove, spikenard, mastic, frankincense, grain, wormwood, crabfoot, date pits, and olives. Grind all of these and reduce them to a powder, then rub in the affected areas. That's a lot of stuff. And I feel like frankincense was historically like, I mean, I think everyone knows it from the Bible, it being a precious gift that we gave to our Lord and Savior. Like, I feel like this stuff's hard to get. I don't even know what some of them are. I've never heard of spikenard.
Yeah, absolutely. That one doesn't stand out to me as like an absolutely bonkers list of ingredients, because there are others that are like completely bonkers lists of ingredients. But so here we have to think about, again, this is a recipe book. It's probably based on recipes that are transmitted, maybe not so much from your like grandmother or your great grandmother or whatever, but more like from like a somewhat unattainable recipe book. Like it's in your own kitchen now, right? Sometimes there are recipe books that are like Heston Blumenthal, and he's got lists of things that you could just, never, ever, ever do in your own kitchen. But you still got the book,
Yeah.
right? And you still kind of do what you can with the recipe that's been given to you. And so I think you just say like, well, I don't have any frankincense. I'm just gonna cross that off the list and do what I, make this in a slightly different way.
Garten situation. If you don't have your own store bought, is fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And to be fair, there actually are manuscripts which give kind of equivalents of, I can't give you an example off the top of my head, but that there are kind of equivalencies for things that you might have been able to get in the Roman period when there was trade between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean at a much more frequent level than there was in the Middle Ages. And so here, if you don't have spikenard, well, do this, do the other. Here's an equivalency for you. So yeah, people were
I
definitely
love that.
aware of that.
That's incredible. So I think one of the other things you're talking about, like this like rural or urban, like kind of educated, like you have these like medicinal men who have gone to an institute of higher learning, but then of course there's also other people in rural areas who are still providing healthcare who are not these medicinal men. And like, to me, like the person that springs to mind would be like a midwife, right?
Mhm.
Or like just local. It feels to me like it, and this could just be an idea I have in my head. It feels like it's like local women doing stuff to keep people alive as best as they can.
Well, there's two. I mean, there are women, and I can't remember if the recipe you just quoted from is from a trotula recipe or not.
Correct.
Yeah.
Caroline.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So there are two kinds of people. The first, I would have said, is actually a priest, and we know from manuals that we have these little priest books, which are like little manuscripts that have a whole bunch of like the stuff that you need to know if you're a local priest. And often they include recipes for medical treatments in them. Now, is that a trained professional? No. Well, maybe he's a trained professional priest,
Yeah.
but is he a trained medical professional? No. But he's the person that people go to for help. And it does seem like that's one way in which healthcare was actually delivered. Your thought about midwife is I think very, very apposite. I think that's probably true. Here we get into the issue of whether midwifery and gynecological matters are something that women dealt with, or whether men dealt with them, and the degree to which women might have been trained indirectly or at some remove from kind of a professional medical training. But the recipe collection that you're referring to includes quite a lot of gynecological material, and it's known as the Trotula book. So it's known as there's a single manuscript that's kind of the earliest version of it, and it's a compilation of medical material that's associated with a woman who goes by the name Trotula, who's based in Salerno in the 12th century. So was she exceptional by being kind of party to this literary, textual, learned male urban society, and she's just sort of one glimpse of how women interact with that? Or is she very, very typical, and we don't have any other examples of these kinds of manuscript collections? We don't know the answer to that, so we just have this kind of one example. But it's a real consideration, the degree to which certain kinds of care might have gone under the textual radar. And certainly things that women did go under the textual radar.
Yes. This is again why like people like mixing archaeology and history, because it's like, in theory, archaeology can give a voice to people who don't have a textual record, but at the same time, like the things that you can say with archaeology are different. Not to say that there's bias in every data set, which is something that we actually talk a lot about on this show.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I am still curious about toothworms, unless you have something else you would like to say about
Worms are great.
Doctoring.
No, Trent, go for the toothworms.
Yeah, so this is something that certainly surprised me. And the idea here is that toothworms seem to have originated probably in the Roman period, at least as far as Caroline and I could trace back. It seems to come from Scribonius Largus, who was a Roman chronicler, I guess physician potentially. I forget his
compiler of medical texts.
Okay,
yeah.
Sure. Great, thank you. And he seems to describe that worms could be the cause potentially of toothache. And that seems to catch on and sort of spiral, at least from what we end up seeing in the medieval period. And we start to see a proliferation of different understandings of toothworms. So the idea that worms are embedded within the teeth, causing decay, that is, they're almost gnawing at the enamel and the dentine underneath, and as a result, a lot of the prescriptions that we see seem to chase them out. That is, maybe we will, I'll look at this one here. So Apostle Peter's toothache caused by an old worm devouring his teeth. Jesus instructed the worms to make them go away. And this was a particular brief or short notice, a blessing in this case. But we also see certain prescriptions of things like smoke fumigations. So maybe one of the ways in which people tried to treat toothworms was to create a form of incense or some sort of bowl that you would presumably light on fire to create smoke, and you'd inhale it. The smoke mixed with the compounds that you've lit would chase the toothworms out of your teeth, and you'll see these various prescriptions say that worms will start falling out. In some cases, they also seem to be prescribed as a form of treatment as well. So this would come from Ibn Sina or Avicenna, as we often see. Am I saying that right, Caroline? Is it Avicenna? Okay. The Latinized version. From his Canon of Medicine, this was a very famous Arabic physician who explains that cabbage caterpillars could be placed on teeth that were suffering from toothache to basically accelerate tooth loss and have the cabbage caterpillars eat them away. So it seems to be, at least in a number of references, thought that worms were capable of consuming teeth or eroding teeth. And so you would have various prescriptions to chase them out, or maybe even plant them in there to try to get the tooth out faster.
It's funny because like the idea of putting the worms in the teeth, I'm like, yeah, that actually feels very reasonable to me, because we use medical maggots all the time.
Sure.
That's true.
I'm like, I get that. The idea of worms just chilling in your teeth it feels crazy to me.
But it's the idea that worms cause the pain that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not. I mean, they might have thought that bacteria, like
Yeah.
that there's this microscopic thing that's causing pain. That's crazy. Worm, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's
totally.
It's small enough, right? It's small enough to where you can still see it. It's in there. And we actually see a number of artistic representations of this in the later 16th and really up into the 18th century. We see a number of depictions. There's a really kind of famous one that was probably carved out of ivory that was a tooth, like a whole molar that had pegs and holes together that you could then open up. And that would open up and show inside these little worms and then fire or flames as if hell or purgatory or something like that. And it would close up and look like a whole molar, but open up, and it's very, very detailed. There's a replica of one made from plastic in one of the museums in Germany. And that actually gets picked up later by some people trying to make forgeries in Islamic medicine of showing tooth worms in Islamic art, which is really interesting. But the idea is there that worms are sort of embedded within the tooth pulp chamber, let's say, and burrowing their way out, causing the pain as well as potential cavitation.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Like you're seeing these holes. What makes holes worms? I didn't even think about that. Okay, so we're getting close to the top of the hour. I wanted to ask, is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you really want to talk about?
We could talk forever about this, I think.
Caroline and I have.
there's a lot to say about the way you kind of make sense of what you've got in the archaeological record and what you've got in the textual record and how it impinges on like everyday experience. I think there's a huge amount there. I think there's a couple of things that we haven't talked about, and maybe if I drop out, then Trent can pick it up and give it to you about like people lost a lot of teeth.
Yeah.
People were walking around in the pre-modern world, but certainly in our rural village in Italy, without a lot of their teeth. Like to the degree that it surely would have affected the way they spoke, the way they ate, everything about what they were doing. And so I think it's worth bearing that in mind, that this is not some sort of fantasy, projected back on the dark ages of the Middle Ages. It's like I think the reality, not just of the Middle Ages, of the pre-modern past, that people were grappling with tooth decay, abscesses, really, really, really serious tartar issues, all kinds of stuff, all over the place. And it was shaped a lot by genetics, but I think it was shaped an awful lot by diet and like the degree to which there was grit in the food that they were eating. And maybe also the degree to which they had access to some of these medical practitioners who could have alleviated some of their problems.
Yeah.
But the reality of people's mouths in the Middle Ages was probably pretty distasteful to us.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to your original question, Gabby, of what were medieval mouths like. The perception I often show my students visually is Terry Jones from Monty Python and Life of Brian. There's this and if anyone has not seen that, I encourage you to Google it. Just Terry Jones, Monty Python, Life of Brian. There's this kind of famous image of him with these prosthetics that look awful. I mean, just chipped and gnarly. The enamel's all gone. And the question Caroline and I set out was, well, how accurate is that? Is that just a caricaturization? Is that actually accurate? But tooth loss, antemortem tooth loss, was certainly quite high. And there are certain sites in our small meta-analysis that we conducted within the study with our graphs, we see that there is some variability depending on where you're looking in the medieval period. But that generally speaking, yes, there's a tremendous amount of antemortem tooth loss, whether as a result of cavities, like Caroline stated, or probably gritty diets, again, milling, and these stones probably incorporated a lot of unintentional grit that seems to have facilitated advanced wear. Once you expose the dentin and have worn away the enamel, you're a bit more likely sometimes to increase cavitation. So all these sorts of things. And what we were interested in was how's that cascade into experience, into aesthetics, right? How does that cascade into how people interact with each other? We sort of posited, it's hard to prove, but we talked about speech in one way. So when you don't have your upper first incisors, right, things like fricatives, like making an F sound, become a bit more tricky because you don't have those teeth to be able to like use it as much. Or So we were even thinking about things like speech and whatnot, and that probably so this would have been probably a daily topic of conversation or embodied experience. But finding the evidence for it has certainly been tricky, and that's also what's been so fun in terms of us collaborating together.
Yes. Yeah. I feel like having good teeth, that's something that we still care about a lot. Like, have you seen those TikTok videos of people who just look at celebrity veneers? Like,
No.
we just so you know, Dr. Goodson is laughing at that too.
We're also, I will say, Americans are very particular. I remember giving a talk in Europe about something, and I had a couple members of people throughout Europe, some people from England, some people from Portugal, from Italy, and they were saying, yeah, you guys have a very specific aesthetic, when it comes to teeth. So
One of the things that I also saw throughout your article is that people did care about the aesthetics of their teeth. Like they had all
mhm.
these things that they tried to do to make their teeth look better, which when you don't have that many, like you want them to shine like diamonds.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you want to avoid the worms.
You want to avoid
Yeah.
the worms. Um, okay, I think this is a good place to stop me querying you about all this stuff. I'm going to start with Dr. Goodson. I have 3 questions that I ask everyone. The first question is, if people wanted to learn more about the kind of research you do, where is a good place for them to start? Like, what's a good starter text for people who are interested in your kind of history?
My kind of history, or this kind of intersection between history and archaeology
Either
and
one.
bioarchaeology?
Yeah.
Well, so I would point people to a book by Roberta Gilchrist called The Medieval Life Course, which she's an archaeologist. She's based here in Britain. And she's done, I think, really, really good work on, in this case, British and Scottish bioarchaeology, but also bioarchaeology alongside quite a lot of other material culture questions.
And then what are you reading for work right now?
Oh gosh. um, I'm reading a book about volcanoes and earthquakes and Cyprus in the 6th century,
Oh.
by Virginia Burroughs. It's a sort of environmental history book, and I can't remember the title of it at the moment. Sorry.
That's okay. That's enough for me to find it. And I will also be posting this on my website. That's why I ask all
Yeah,
these
I'll
questions.
look it up and I'll email it to you later on. Yeah.
That would be lovely. And then my third question is, what are you consuming for fun right now? And this can be anything: books, TV shows, hiking.
Okay, so I'm reading a book called The Extraordinary Life of William Ellis, which is about a slave in Texas who becomes a Mexican millionaire,
Wow.
by Carol Jacobi.
Huh.
That sounds so interesting. I'm adding that to my list of, I'm not allowed to buy any more books because
You can get it from the library.
that's a really good idea. Oh my gosh. That's such a good idea. Yeah, there's books that are on all of my dining room chairs. So there's nowhere for people to sit when they can sit on the ground. The books have the chairs. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Goodson. Just in case you drop off, I'm going to ask Dr. Trombley the exact same questions. Dr. Trombley, where should people start if they're interested in your kind of bioarchaeology?
Yeah, it's funny. Roberta Gilchrist stuff is so good in this regard. I think as an intersection of bioarchaeology as well as sort of monasticism and framing it from a medievalist perspective, I would say, which is really important in trying to take that perspective rather than maybe a more traditional bioarchaeological perspective. I think some of the work by Lauren Hosek would also be a great place to start, and Shannon Novak. They have some fantastic ways of looking at human skeletal remains and bioarchaeology but from a more detailed textural historical perspective. And I really, really admire their work quite a bit.
Perfect. And what are you reading for work right now?
Still powering through a number of teaching manuals. One of the ones I'm still working through is Discussion as a Way of Teaching. It's a really good book on giving different ways of active learning strategies. That's been a really fun one. And then in terms of research, some research on histotophonomy. So this would be the analysis of histological slides of bone, but in this case for assessing diagenesis, for how degraded they can become from bacteria, whether that's through soil or through endogenous gut bacteria. That's kind of what I'm working on right now.
Neat. Um, Now I have a lot of questions, but what are you consuming for fun right now?
Yeah, so this is fun now, but it's going to be. I'm hoping to get a class next fall on this for campus here. And it's one of them is called Black Smoke: African Americans in the United States of Barbecue, as well as Smoke Lore and a Short History of Barbecue in America. So I'm hoping to teach a sort of folklore of barbecue class in the United States as part of our writing program. And so there's some sort of fun books. They're not hyper academic, but I just learned from a colleague here on campus that he went to graduate school at University of Texas, Austin, with a number of friends who did ethnography of barbecue throughout Texas. And so I'm hoping to kind of follow up on that as well. So a bit of work and fun, but barbecue is kind of my like fun thing, but I try to nerd out about it as much as possible.
I have a lot of thoughts about barbecue because I grew up in the South, which I will save for another time.
Yeah,
I grew up in Texas. You're not going to find any barbecue better than Texas, I'll tell you what.
Yeah, exactly. And I would probably agree. Texas style is kind of my. I'm from California, so I don't have a fair dog or anything like that in the race. But Texas is the style I admire the most.
Listen, vinegar-based barbecue is where it's at.
That's going to start a fight. I think. I'm gonna run away. Okay.
All right.
It was so nice having you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice chatting with you both. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.